All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Bay. I really appreciate it. For those of you that are out there, my name is Jared Fishman. Some of you might be familiar with me in terms of one of the other presentations that I've done for Goose and for Georgetown University. I had done about 3 years ago a presentation on the effective use of games in the classroom. So that video is available. I would actually suggest that you look at that because that video talks a lot about how to use games in the classroom, which to some extent, this presentation that I'm about to deliver is sort of based on. So you'll see what I mean as we go. Technically the title of this presentation is The Hidden Power of Games, Game-Based Models Within the Corporate Environment. What we're going to talk today about is the journey that I've sort of been on over, I would say, the last year about taking some of what I do in the classroom and then breaking out into sort of a more corporate environment. In terms of who I am, I'll go to some slides that I've sort of presented or prepared for this presentation. So we'll talk a little bit about who I am in part one and what 20-sided gamified is. It's also really important for us to define our terms, meaning when we talk about game-based learning or corporate training, what does that actually mean? How do games end up in a corporate environment, and how can games be really helpful in terms of business moving forward? We'll also talk a little bit about what the genesis of 20-sided gamified was. And when I say why this work, what I really mean by that is why get into this field? Why kind of break out from what I've been doing in the classroom and, sort of break out into a more corporate environment? And probably the most cringeworthy part of the presentation, because it's always, I don't know about you, but like the way I was raised, I wasn't exactly taught to constantly talk about myself and why I'm good at things, but at the same time, we do have to kind of talk about why 20-side gamified is unique in our approach and what makes myself and some of the other people that I work with a little bit different than some of the other people that do corporate training and professional development. So that's part one. Part two, I'm going to give you an example program that I rolled out in September of 2023 with the Passaic County Office of Culture and Heritage. You'll probably hear me mention the name Kelly McManus a bunch because he's one of the people that I sort of came into contact with quite a while ago, actually. And he's been a really integral part of not just practicing some of these methods and in his own office, but also just like he's a relatively big part of 20-Side Gamified. And part three will be more of just some final thoughts on everything that we've talked about, plus a Q&A. I don't expect this to go more than an hour, but then again, as I was joking with Sebastian before we started, I said the same thing last time and it ended up going an hour and 40 minutes. That was with questions and such, so we'll have to see how it goes. So for part one, I'll talk a little bit about who I am. So if you don't know me, if you didn't see the last presentation I did with Georgetown, or if you've never listened to 20-Sided Gamified, our podcast that I do with Kelly, my name is Jared Fishman. Primarily, I'm a classroom teacher. So I've been working in schools since 2004, and that is very scary to me. So it's been about 20 years since I started working with students, and I've really kind of done everything from working at the college level to working in independent schools. I was at Hackley, which is a school in Tarrytown, for a very long time. And last time I presented with Goose, I was working at Hackley at that time, but now I'm at a school called Brunswick in Greenwich, Connecticut. I've also done a number of other things, I guess you could say, within schools. So, for example, I was a chair in history for a period of time. I was the dean for a period of time. And also, in terms of almost like consulting work, I've also worked for NICEACE, which is the organization. It's called New York State Association of Independent Schools. And what they basically do is they help with hiring and working with new teachers, and even in some cases doing other type of work with more experienced teachers. Me personally, I was a facilitator with them in mentoring young teachers through a program called the Beginners Teachers Institute, which actually is one of the first moments where I started thinking about how to take some of the activities that I would do for a teacher, right, given that they're an adult compared to the students I work with, and actually take that into a more corporate or professional environment. In addition to some of those other things that I do, I'm the president of 20-Sided Gamified LLC, which was founded in March of 2023. I also helped found HMGS Next Gen Inc. which is an organization that I was part of for about 4 years. I still am friendly with the folks there and I still work with them here and there. They're a little bit more focused on going, for example, to libraries and schools and running games, which is something that I have somewhat strayed away from recently. Last but not least, I won the Rising Star Award in 2019 for the best new workshop with NISAGA. NISAGA stands for North American Simulations and Games Society. I and a teacher from Hackley, we ran a workshop called Decision Making Through the Eyes of a Person named Papilius. And that was a role-playing simulation that really like did wonderful at that conference and everybody loved it, hence the award. So that's just a little bit about who I am. Now, in terms of what 20-sided gamified is, really it kind of comes from the following. So it's my belief that game-based work with students can have the same positive impact on adults, meaning the same kind of methodology I use in the classroom with students when it comes to using games to help as a teaching tool. My belief is that that can also be used with adults, really what it comes down to. So in terms of the multi sort of faceted approach to the company, we have a podcast platform called the 20-sided gamified podcast. We've been doing that show for more than a year. I believe March 2023 was our first episode. We interview all sorts of people, including authors and game designers, and we've had an absolute blast with that. Now, that's one facet of the company. In terms of the other things that we do, we facilitate corporate workshops using a game-based approach, which is really the whole point of this presentation that we're doing here. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. We've also done work with university students and professors, and in particular, professors that are really looking for fun ways to engage their students. And also, something that we've done quite a bit of is help folks develop their own game-based models, meaning professors that will reach out to me or business people that will reach out to me and saying, hey, like I've heard of you or I've heard of game-based learning. How could I use some of that in my own workplace? So we will kind of do some consultations with people like that and give them a sense of really like how to make that happen. So that's really what 20-sided gamified LLC is. We worked with a ton of people. This photo was a very, very recent photo in April of 2024, where Kelly and I and a couple of other folks that are associated with 20SG, we went to Salute 2024, which is the single biggest wargaming convention, one-day convention in the world. And all of the folks that are on there are basically game-based learning specialists or game designers. That's me waxing philosophical about something, uh, which was a ton of fun, to say the least. But point is we work with a lot of different people. So, I mean, we've been to Yale, Marist, Georgetown, New Paltz, Westchester Community College, just to name a few of the universities. We've been to dozens of libraries, tons of major conventions. So Connection, Salute, Historicon, PAX. These are all places that we've either done media work, interviewing people, or in a lot of cases, actually going in and running games with people that have, put in a call to us and saying like, hey, like we would love to have you, present something. So just as an example of what I mean by that. So Historicon 2024, which is a big wargaming convention here in the United States, in July of 2024, Kelly, myself, and a couple of other folks were going to be there. And not only are we going to be interviewing people, but we have a gaming table there. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be running games for the entire weekend, which is going to be an absolute blast. So those are some of the groups that we've been sort of working with. Now, let's define some terms. Now, again, truth be told, when it comes to game-based learning, I cannot stress this enough. If you're really interested in this, I'm really going to give a very quick answer to what game-based learning is. But if you go back to the presentation I did 3 years ago here with Goose, that's where we really go in depth about what game-based learning is. But short version, right? I'll just read this to you. In game-based learning involves designing learning activities so that game characteristics and game principles inherent within the learning activities themselves. For example, in an economics course, students might compete in a virtual stock trading competition. In a political science course, students might role play as they engage in mock negotiations involving a labor dispute. And that definition comes from the University of Waterloo, Center for Teaching Excellence. So if you kind of read between the lines here, it's really about the following, right? So if we kind of break this apart, it's all about taking games, whether we're talking about role playing or tabletop war games or board games, and essentially taking a game and tailoring it to whatever it is that you're doing in a classroom, or in the case of 20SG, working with adults at different companies, taking a game and using it for a specific purpose, like designing a game for either skill building or decision making or team building. And that's really what game-based learning is. What does the data say? Now, again, I am a data person, but with presentations like this, I think it's probably better to give you 20 years of experience and just sort of analyze what I've seen and analyze what the documents have said. When I say documents, I'm talking about the different papers that people have put out. But the bottom line is there's a ton of data out there. I won't read all of these to you, but when you sort of do the math and you look at the numbers and you look at people's experiences, if I just pick out a couple of these, if we think about the classroom, having kids sit there and just be the receivers of information where all they do is sit and write vocabulary words, that's one thing. And don't get me wrong, even though I just presented that in a very negative way, there is obviously some benefit to that. But it's one thing to learn about the Congress of Vienna from 1815 and just take some notes on it and write an essay about it. It's another thing to actually play the parts of people that were at the Congress and actually have to think the way that they thought at the conference and actually engage with people in your class in an attempt to get things that you want for your country. That's very different. So, in terms of running a game like that for students, it really encourages kids to think outside the box. It makes them think about themselves. It asks them to reflect about who they are. Also, if you think about the world we live in right now, it really promotes debate and really healthy discussion. It really kind of asks kids to kind of get into it with each other. And ultimately, one last point that I'll make is, players learn by doing. So, actually getting in there and you do the things that you're really studying, right? And what we have found, when I say we, I mean really like game-based learning specialists or people who are really into this. What we have found is that lots and lots and lots and lots of different papers have been written on the subject. And ultimately, the points that I just made, these are things that happen in the classroom. And we know it because of so many different studies that have been done, whether we're talking about literally, the University of Catalonia in Spain or Harvard Business School, Columbia University. If you do just a quick Google search, you will find tons of PDFs where people are kind of talking about how effective this kind of learning can be. Now, again, if you go back and look at the presentation I did a couple of years ago, it kind of goes much more in depth about that. Another model that we need to think a little bit about is what we mean when we say corporate training. Now, again, it's always a little weird doing Zoom presentations because I don't know who's in quote unquote this room with me. All I see is that there are 22 participants, right? So I don't know how old you are. I don't know, if you're in college or if you're in the workplace. So taking all that into account, if we summarize this really quickly, I just like to kind of call corporate training, it's school for adults in the professional world. So for example, if you work for Microsoft or you work for Meta or you work for Amazon, wherever it is that you work, you will more or less in your professional workspace, you'll be asked to go to training sessions. And those training sessions are sometimes very specific about whatever that business does, right? Or in some cases, it could be about you getting better as an employee. So companies will shell out millions of dollars over the course of many years to hire companies to come in and do this kind of work. I like to kind of consider it school for adults, right? Because if you go to these professional trainings, and by the way, teachers do this all the time, it's essentially the same kinds of activities in a lot of cases that students sort of sit through when they're in school. So, kind of putting all of this together, where is the genesis of 20-sided gamified? And where is the genesis of this idea that I had where I would love to sort of translate some of what I do in the classroom into a more corporate environment? So, here's where I can be a little bit inflammatory, right? And I joke about this on the podcast a lot. I'll try to be kind. Again, I'm not sure who's in this meeting right now, but I can assure you that a lot of professional development is not very fun. A lot of times, you end up with somebody who might have a great resume on paper, or maybe they went to school for industrial psychology and they know how to put survey questions together, and then they get in front of you. And I'm not intending on being disrespectful, but a lot of times these sort of just get up there and they talk at you for about an hour if you're lucky, and then you leave and maybe you took something away from it. That has been my experience at many, many, many professional development sessions. They often are not very engaging, and you're almost thinking, and again, lots of people will tell you this. You're almost thinking, what is this easiest way that I can get out of this space quickly? Or how can I get out of even going in the first place? So that's one thing that has always been on my mind. And I've always said to myself, like anybody, right? I would imagine some of you listening have had this moment where you say to yourself, I can do that better. Why is somebody being paid thousands of dollars to come in and make everybody bored? That's one facet of my thinking on this. Here's another thing I've noticed over the years. Now, I'm a lifelong gamer, and I have always noticed that when you put dice in somebody's hand, they change. I have noticed that for as long as I've been a gamer. People who are really passive all of a sudden become very aggressive. Some people who are super aggressive and you put dice in their hands, all of a sudden they become very meek. People that are very extroverted all of a sudden are introverted. And I have always noticed that, and I've always wondered why that is. So that's another genesis of this. And again, trust me, you'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. Now, it's a little bit hard to remember the exact date, but this young fella on the right side of the screen, Kelly McManus, he's an important part of 20SG as a company. He works for Dimension, Washington's headquarters, and he works in the office that we've been sort of working with over the last year or so in terms of doing some professional development work. Kelly had heard me on a podcast talking about education. And the podcast in question was the Little Wars TV. If you've never heard of it, they're a very, very big and pretty prominent wargaming group that they make videos about the games that they play. They're very popular. I mean, they get thousands upon thousands upon thousands of views. In fact, if my memory serves me right, our very own Dr. Sebastian Bay was in one of those videos. If my memory serves me right, he had played in one of the games. I believe it was at the Marine Museum, I believe, in Virginia. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think I am. We'll have to see at the end if he can confirm that. But they're great. And Kelly had heard me on it, and he had reached out to me, and he asked me something that, again, at the time, I had been really used to working mostly with students in the classroom. And what he asked about was, well, what about taking that skill set and bringing it to the Dimension and bringing it to a more of a museum environment? And what about working with people that have never really gamed before? And in many cases, they're adults. This was really one of the first times that somebody had asked about that kind of work. And that really got me thinking about working more with adults. This also coincides with another sort of breakthrough moment for me in terms of the work that I do. So I was at NISAGA 2022, their conference. It was in Montreal, and it was right around the same time that I was working with Kelly at the Dimension. And if I'm just being honest with you, I knew that I was going to run a workshop when I was at NISAGA, but I wasn't 100% sure of what I wanted to do. And I just sort of had this idea. I remember thinking to myself about, more of the corporate world, and I started thinking more to myself about why is it that people change when they put those dice in their hands? I decided to run a diplomacy game, which interestingly doesn't use dice. If you've ever played the game, it is one of my students' favorite game in the whole world. And I decided that what I was going to do was I was going to see how people saw themselves before they even knew what they were playing and how they saw themselves after. This was a very profound moment for me. In fact, the picture on the left is from that session. And you can see the picture on the right is the first piece of media that 20SG ever sort of put out. A really good friend of mine, Matt Rendar, who owns a company called Battle Tribe, and he does all sorts of animation and things like that. He took that image from NISAGA 2022, and it was profound enough that really has become a hallmark for what we do at 20SG. So that goes to show you what the moment meant for me. Now, it might be a little bit hard to see. And also, I don't have the original survey. This was actually the survey I used with the office in Passaic County. But essentially, here's what I noticed. I asked folks questions about how they saw themselves and how they saw themselves, whether they're an introvert, an extrovert, whether they're a team player, whether they're a follower, whether they're a leader. And I had everybody rate themselves. I didn't tell them why. I just had them rate themselves. Then we did this 2 hour workshop. And again, if you remember, folks are playing diplomacy. Everybody had a blast. But what was very profound is that when I gave them the informal questionnaire after the fact, what I noticed is in almost every single case, people saw more about their abilities compared with how they saw themselves before they played the game. Meaning, by playing the game, people started to see themselves in a very different way. And in almost every single case, it was a positive change. And what this told me in this moment was there's something about using games with adults to help them learn more about their own skill set and learn more about themselves. So ultimately, that was the genesis for creating 20-sided gamified and really starting to sort of branch out into this more corporate environment. And ultimately, the question that I asked myself, can games be used as a tool to unlock skills that people didn't even realize they have? Ultimately, you can see that photo of one of the most famous progressive rock bands in history. The answer was yes. And I have been doing that sort of work over the last year. Obviously, there's more work that needs to be done, meaning I need to practice more and I need to get out there more and really show people how powerful games can be. But ultimately, I'm pretty darn convinced that this is a really positive thing for people. Now, what makes 20SG unique? And here's what I mean by that. There are lots of companies out there that do training. There's lots of companies that do professional development. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of people that have used games in a corporate environment. I am not pretending here that somehow 20SG is the first group that has ever done this. However, we are unique. And again, this is always one of those cringeworthy moments because I want to be very careful in the sense of I don't want to pat myself on the back too much, right? But there is something unique about this company, and that's what I want to get into next. The formula for 20SG is the idea of being a teacher, the idea of being a gamer, and the idea of being a learner. If corporate training is school for adults, there are no better people than teachers to do this work. Now, again, don't get me wrong. There are industrial psychologists out there who go to school, who learn how to make surveys, they learn how to work with people, they learn how to go into an environment and really affect and impact change. One of my best friends growing up does that sort of work. He was one of those people that would go to a place like Facebook and create surveys for people to take and questionnaires in order to help people be more effective at what they do. Don't get me wrong, people do that. Here's my argument, though. That's not really fun. Meaning for the people that are involved, where they just sort of sit there and take these questionnaires and then they're talked at, that is not particularly engaging. The way I see 20SG, being a teacher, having that gaming background, and also being a learner, it's a perfect formula for doing this kind of work where people are going to actually enjoy it. So let's talk about being a teacher. Now, I will be inflammatory for a second. I saw the most ridiculous meme the other day. I was on Instagram doing a little bit of work for the company, and I had come across this unbelievably offensive, ridiculous statement that somebody made online, where I guess somebody had posted a meme about teaching where, you know, it basically said like how teachers feel in May, and it showed this poor person running along a track trying to jump over hurdles, and every time they jump they hit a hurdle, and it almost seems like they're going to fall, and the hope is that they kind of get to the end. And these people are making comments about how the rest of the world, everybody works for 12 months, essentially like denigrating what teachers do, the fact that again, we get time off. What I would love to do, right, and this goes back to what I had said earlier about learners. Don't get me wrong, I'm not the smartest person in the world. I don't think I want to trade jobs with a doctor in which I have to perform surgery, right? It's probably not going to be a good idea. But you know what? For a lot of people, I would love for somebody to come in and work as a teacher for 1 week where I work, and I'll just switch jobs with them. I don't think people realize the kind of skill set that teachers earn inside the classroom by doing the kind of work that we do. And again, these points that I've made here on the slide, I am not going to read all of them to you, but if you look here and read these points, these are the kinds of skills that teachers learn. And in so many different ways, when you think about corporate training and really trying to go into an office and help people be more effective, I can't think of people that are better to do that than teachers. So think about this, right? And my entire life as a teacher is about helping people. It's almost a curse to some degree in the sense that when I walk into a room and meet somebody, I'm just instinctively trained to talk to them for 5 minutes and wonder how they could be a better person. Now, I don't know how that sounds to you, but it's frankly what I do and have been doing for 20 years. And it's not just students, it's helping parents be better parents, it's helping other teachers be better at what they want to do. And it's also about helping administrators run schools better, right? Think about the skills that teachers have. We're adept at conversation. We're not one of those people typically that gets in front of an audience and doesn't know what to say. We are practically, uh, showmen to some degree. We're showmen that know things because ultimately, when it comes to your children, if you have children in this room, or just frankly, when you're in a classroom, our job is to be entertaining, keep your attention, and also be smart throughout the whole process. We're trained to have unbelievably difficult conversations. I could spend hours talking to you when I was a dean about all of the really difficult conversations that I've had to have in my life. We have to learn quickly. We have to constantly learn new methods to assess how somebody's growing. Point being, we are in a lot of ways the perfect people to go into a corporate environment, read the room, and figure out what it is that will help that company grow. Now, for me, there's another added bonus here in terms of this work. I'm a lifelong gamer. In so many different ways, it's actually harder to run a really good game than it is to actually teach a lesson. Running games is really, really difficult. And if there are gamers in the space right now, you know what I'm talking about. Don't get me wrong, there are some people who are not very good at it. But if you're good, you're good. And it takes a long time to be able to learn that talent, right? So for me, I am a bit unique in this world of corporate training because of my teaching background, because of my background with gaming, and the fact that I'm a learner. Because ultimately, well, I'm not going to pretend that I went to school to learn how to create a survey or a questionnaire for people that work with Facebook to be able to answer, right? I didn't go to school for that, but I learned how to do it. So I think that that's really important. And I'm rather sure that the people that are in this space here are more than likely that way as well. So when you put those three things together, I believe that that makes 20SG a very unique group of people, myself and Kelly and some of the other folks that we work with. It makes us unique in terms of being able to run corporate training using a game model. So that was part one. Part two is now actually getting into the nitty gritty of what a corporate training using a game-based model, what it actually looks like, which is probably the most important part of today. Now, here's what I did. The slides that you're about to look at, with a couple of little exceptions, are literally the slides that I used when I worked in Passaic County in Kelly's office, working with about a dozen or so people that work for the office. And what I mean by that is he's just thinking a little bit about the kind of work that they do. These are archivists. These are purple people that do not purple people that do tours of museums. These are folks that do almost like archaeology to some extent. And they also have to work with the general public. And it's all about, it's not a school per se, but it's all about presenting information to people about the different sites in New Jersey that have historical value and relevance. So when I was hired to come in, here's the deal. I was told that the biggest issue that the office was having was with teamwork. We had were coming out of COVID. And what I was asked to do was, can you design a really fun game and program that will help the office with team building, learning how to build skills, learning to have camaraderie in the workplace? So the presentation that you're looking at is exactly the presentation that I shared with them. Now, obviously, I'm not going to spend hours going through every single slide, but what I am going to do is give you as much of a sense of what the program looked like as I can. And frankly, if you're watching, thinking about hiring 20-sided gamified, this is going to give folks a really, really good sense of what a program might look like. So without further ado, here we go. Whenever I run a workshop, the very first thing that I do is I establish what the goals are. I did this with you as well at the very beginning of this presentation, where I outlined exactly what part one would be, part two would be, part three would be. When I walked into that office in Passaic County, I went over the fact that I really wanted to have fun. In fact, that was the starting point and the finishing point. If you're not having fun learning, it's a real problem. That is something that I absolutely 100% live by. What I explained to the people in the audience, and again, it was about a dozen different people of all different ages and genders. It was all about thinking, what are the strengths that we have as individuals? How do we use those strengths in the workplace? And you can use the word skill building there as well, meaning the kinds of skills that we have. Another major point of the day was really putting out in the open the kinds of roadblocks or impediments that can sometimes get in our way. Because my belief, it's the same as the classroom, my belief is that before you start to think about how to get better, you also have to think about what's getting in your way of that. And it has to be a very open kind of conversation. And last but not least, after doing some activities, and I'm going to show you exactly what the activities look like, then we were going to basically play a game called Unlocking the Portal. So that really was the ultimate goals that I had for that workshop. And let's go into some detail about what some of these actual activities look like. Also, by the way, before we get into that, I do love to give people a sense of what they'll leave with. So, and I'm very proud of this, that we did accomplish these things. You know, those dozen people, I wanted them to have confidence. I wanted to have them to have a better sense of who they were and what they were good at, a renewed sense of goals. And also really, really important when you're talking about a team is, what is your role on that team? I wanted people to think about all of those concepts. So I'm going to skip the plan and let's just go right into it. So the first thing that you should always do in a workshop like this is not really gamified per se, but really like getting to know people, having an introduction and allowing people to sort of share out. So what I asked them was, think a little bit, about a stranger you might be talking to, and what are the adjectives that you might use to describe yourself? What would they be? And then I asked them to think a little bit about the adjective that would describe their best strength. What is your greatest strength? What would it be and why? That's a really difficult way to start in a lot of ways, because generally speaking, people, I mean, there are some exceptions to this, but people generally can be very reserved with somebody they don't know. And here's where the teaching element comes in. My job is to be personable. Hopefully I'm being personable here, right? So my job was to kind of get in there and really make people feel comfortable, bringing a little bit of food in, even talking with people before the actual event started, going around, shaking hands, getting people to feel comfortable. And by doing that, you get some honesty, and I think that at the very beginning of a workshop, you have to develop that kind of rapport. Now, if I'm being critical, a lot of times in professional development workshops, that doesn't really happen. A lot of times somebody just sort of gets up on a stage and starts talking, or they do what I'm talking about in a very awkward and, sort of bizarre way. So in this particular case, it's all about getting people to feel comfortable, and even more importantly, getting people to think about who they are. That's really why I'm asking them for those kinds of adjectives. This is a little bit of a photo of, or I don't know why I phrase it that way, but this is a photo of what the workshop space looked like. So you can kind of see me on the right side. These are all the people that are involved. And this was when we were kind of rolling out the plan. So as we sort of got to know each other, the first big activity that we did is a classic teacher thing, which again is my point, that you can sort of take things from the classroom and import them into a more sort of adult and professional environment. This is called an impediments activity. If you're going to think a little bit about your own skill set, if you're going to think a little bit about what it means to be on a team and where you fit into it, and if I'm being honest, if you are running a workshop because some of these things are a problem, you have to put the problem out there, which can be really uncomfortable. So what we did was we took pens, we took some sticky notes, and I put prompts all over the workshop space. And what I had people do is I had them go around, and on those sticky notes, I had them either respond directly to the prompt, or I had them respond directly to something else that somebody had already said, meaning they put a post-it note up there and somebody's responding to that. Now, there are obviously some rules here. One, it's supposed to be done completely silent, and you're never really supposed to mention names. It's so in a lot of ways, it's very abstract. So this is actually what that activity looks like. So it's a little bit hard to see what some of the questions are, but I had put some things up there about, communication. I had put some stuff up there about gossip, the kinds of typical issues that you see around the water cooler in the office. And all of those sticky notes are ideas that people had come up with. And then what we did was we debriefed those impediments. We put out there what the issues were in the office. So that's really step one of the whole process. Now, the fun part. The fun part is a game called Unlocking the Portal. This is where 20SG is very different than a lot of other companies because what I just described is, meaning the impediments activity, that's in most teachers' playbooks. And frankly, people who do this kind of work in the professional world, that's kind of like a go-to. What differentiates 20SG is the game-based approach. I designed a game called Unlocking the Portal. It was really fun. And by the way, I'll show you a few more pictures, but you can kind of see that little game set up in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, big bag of dice, some actual 3D terrain on the table, and then you can see those little bits of white paper with a miniature on it. Unlocking the Portal is based on a game called Zombies. I'm going to show you a photo of what that game looks like in a second. But essentially, what the players are doing. They're dividing themselves up into teams and they take on the role of an adventuring character. This game is set almost like in a Victorian sci-fi-esque place. So you are an adventuring character, you're part of an adventuring party, and then you're on an adventuring team. So your party is a little group that you're in, and then the adventuring team is everybody. What players had to do in advance, like after we taught them how to play, is they had to essentially work together to figure out what their characters were good at, how they could complement each other, and how they could actually come up with a plan to win the game. Now, Zombies is one of my favorite games of all time. Not only do I like it for myself and some of my gamer friends, but it's great for kids. Essentially, what it's all about is it's all about defeating a zombie horde. And what happens is you have these little, I guess you could call them tiles. And what you do is you draw a tile from the deck, you put the tile down, and your characters are essentially moving from tile to tile. And what you're doing is you're basically building your own little world. And there are buildings that you can go into, there's loot that you can get. And ultimately, what you're searching for is the helicopter pad. Now, if you, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but if you get a chance to listen to the last presentation that I did with Goose, one of the things that mistakes, I should say, not things, but mistakes that people make a lot of times is that they try to reinvent the wheel and design their own games. To me, it's almost always better to, unless you're like a really hardcore game designer, which I'm sure there are a few of you in this space here, take something that you really like and then you just sort of morph it into what you want it to be and morph it to whatever your goals are, right? So what I did was I took this game, which is super, super, super simple, and I turned it into a more free-flowing miniatures game. And what you can see are in each corner of the table, the players got their characters, and all of their characters are really, really unique. They had to figure out how to play, and then we gamed for about 90 minutes. And again, these are just some more photos of what the table looked like. People had an absolute blast. Also, I want to point out, I'm not going to use names or anything like that, but the gentleman that's on the left, I think he had one of the most profound moments at this session. He had really been very negative about himself before we actually started this game. When he used adjectives, he sort of knocked himself. He called himself lazy, said he was really, really introverted, and he kind of made himself out to be a very almost like a listless person. And very interestingly, we'll sort of get to it as we go through. He was very different in the game. I love this photo. There's nothing better than the sort of synthetic stress that games create, but it's the kind of stress that you can forget about when the game is over, unless you're like me playing a game like Dune Imperium, where you lose sleep because it's such a wild, intense game. I love moments like this because ultimately, the people that were playing really, 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 really got into it. So here are the keys to the game. And notice I didn't really go over how to play. That's not really that important for this presentation. What is important, however, is how does playing this game get you to think about yourself in the work environment? This game was purposely designed, one, to really be about skill evaluation. This game was all about getting a character with a very specific set of skills, badly taking a very famous line from a Liam Neeson movie called Taken. The sequel's not so good, but the original, pretty good. What players had to do was they had to say to themselves, what are these characters good at? What is it that they do? Because some characters in the game were really slow, but really smart. Some characters were very physical, but were, not really good at searching a building. So what players had to do is they had to talk to each other. They had to analyze what their characters were good at, and they had to figure out how could they work as a team. Now, my purpose is really emulating the idea of being in the work environment. What is your role in the work environment? Think about the fact that you all bring something different to the table. If I am an employer, that's literally goal number one that I have. If I have 10 employees, I want to know what they're good at. So the purpose of this game is to get people thinking about those skills. It's a very goal-oriented game, which was purposeful. Teams are basically working together to kill zombies and find clues. The more clues you find, the more chance you have of unlocking the portal and sending the zombies away. So what players had to do is they had to march around the table and figure out how can we be strategic and find as many clues as we can in order to, as a group, get these zombies the hell out of this little town. So again, with the purpose being like the subplot being, how does an entire office sort of come together to achieve a work related goal? Meaning, if your office is working on, a big rollout of a new art exhibit, how does every single person that's assigned to that task, how do you all figure out what you're good at, and how do you design goals that are really going to get you to the end, whatever that end might be? Also, the emphasis on, the team really being greater than the individual, which is really important in a workplace. Lastly, strategic thinking. Because all of the different adventuring parties and teams start in different corners of the map, and the zombie nodes are all over the place, meaning there are different locations where zombies show up, and every building usually will have some, different clues in them. Players really have to talk to each other and figure out what's the best direction to move. How do we divide and conquer? How do we get as many clues as possible? And again, it's all about decisive thinking, meaning we don't want our employees in the workplace to be the kind of people that have to always be told what to do, right? You want people to be decisive thinkers. It's almost like the sense, if you compare here, we'll really nerd out for a second. It's almost like if you look at the beginning of World War One and you look at the end of World War One. So if you're a gamer and you really like World War One games, the beginning of World War One, everything is all about the company, right? Meaning a couple of hundred people all being in lockstep with one another, a couple of officers that are really kind of directing that unit, right? By the time you get to the end of the war, it's really all about small teams. It's more about the platoon. It's more about having lots of decision makers. So the idea of decisive thinking, it's great with a game like this. Everybody loved the game. Absolute blast. And what I was doing while people were playing is as I watched them find successes, I was always going back to the adjectives at the very, very beginning of the session that people said about themselves, and then always were sort of tying it back to the workplace, meaning what do you do on a daily basis. So as an example, that gentleman that I had been talking about earlier, who kind of described himself as being sort of indecisive and, sometimes he could procrastinate a little bit. Interestingly enough, he's like the most outgoing person during the game. He's the one helping everybody. He's the one kind of dishing out orders. He's the one that really put himself, his own character at risk in order for the team to succeed. It was a very profound moment. I remember kind of walking by and poking him a little bit and sort of saying, for somebody who claims that they're very indecisive, you were not that. And the dude just had the biggest smile on his face. And that's the whole point of this seminar that I'm running with you, meaning, and I'll get to this at the end, but There is something about dice that when you put them in people's hands, different parts of themselves that they don't even know exist come out. And the whole point of this kind of training is how can we use games to drag that out of people and then get to see that translate into more success in the workplace. Now, anybody who knows anything about game-based learning knows that debrief is one of the most important parts of game-based learning. You have to debrief. So these were the questions that I had asked people to think about. So what were the strategies that worked? What were the skills that you needed in order to play the game? Meaning, even beyond the skills that your character had, meaning as a team outside of the character that you're portraying, what did you need to do on your team in order to successfully play well? What kind of skills from the game might translate into the workday? And then lastly, I asked people to think about how they now saw themselves differently if you compare the adventuring team to the way they see themselves as an employee. Really awesome conversation. And I will kind of get back to some of the observations that I had from that debrief and from some of the surveys that people had conducted at the end of the whole session. We'll get to that in a little bit. Now, parting thoughts after the game was over is really the last 10 minutes of the workshop. And again, this is a little bit more cut and dry. This is the kind of thing that you might see in lots of different professional development environments. I left folks with four parting sort of thoughts, and they are sort of cumulative. Realize your strengths and harness them, recognize strength in others, communicate, and set goals. Now, again, I'm not going to show you every single slide here because I'm trying to be mindful of time. One of the points that I really hammered home was the ideal of realizing your strengths. And that was a huge part of the whole day, meaning everything from the impediments activity to the adjectives that people use to describe themselves to how they saw themselves in the game. We always in our society get so worried about our shortcomings. We're always talking about what are we not good at and how do we shore up those weaknesses. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with that approach. But the approach that I like to take in addition to that is what are you good at? For example, and this was one of the examples that I used. If you look at mixed martial arts, of which I am a very big fan of, and have been for a really, really long time, if you think about some of the most successful people in mixed martial arts, you think about somebody like Khabib Nurmagomedov or Ronda Rousey or Anderson Silva, they were specialists. They were people that were terrible at certain elements of mixed martial arts, meaning whether you're terrible at the ground game or you're a terrible striker. They didn't care about those things. They didn't work on those things necessarily. They worked on the things that they were really good at. And the way that I tried to translate that into the parting thoughts was you need to think about what you are good at and harness that in your work environment. And circling back to the game, many people, the way that they played the game and what they learned about themselves, what they learned about their strengths, the whole idea was use the game to learn about those strengths that you have and then implement them into your workday. Recognizing strength in others. I'm a huge fan of music and I love David Bowie. But one of the really interesting things about David Bowie is David Bowie knew that he, as an artist, he's not going to bring out the soul in the same way as Tina Turner. He's not necessarily an expert on new wave. He's not necessarily an expert on garage rock. But what David Bowie was really great at as a musician was noticing who other folks were that were good at those things and then actually collaborating with them. So again, in the same sense that people had to collaborate on their adventuring teams, if you look at somebody like David Bowie, knowing who is good at what and harnessing that and combining your skill set with whatever their skill set is usually a good key to having a productive work environment. The concept of being really communicative, to communicate with other people, which unfortunately, the world that we live in now, that is a skill that is slowly but surely going by the wayside. But I took a leadership approach. If you think about some of the most sort of well-renowned and well-regarded leaders, whether you're talking about Queen Elizabeth, JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis, some of the women from the women's suffrage movement in the late 18th and early 19th century. Whomever you're talking about, what really sets them apart as leaders is the fact they were willing to sit down and have conversations. Lastly, setting goals, which we're going to circle back to at the end of this presentation. The idea of setting goals in the workplace, which games can be a great tool for. Um, One of the things that we talked quite a lot about is the fact that some of the most successful people in the world, they are goal setters. If you look at somebody like Steve Jobs, while this is a little bit cliche, if you look at Steve Jobs' career, I can remember, and I don't know about you guys, again, I don't know how old everybody is in the space, but I can remember Apple computers being a joke for a really, really long time. But you have somebody like Steve Jobs who is so goal driven that he has this idea for a little personal computer that you can put in your pocket and it completely changes the world, right? Also, the idea of teamwork, right? The idea of you think about somebody like Michael Jordan, right? He lost a lot of games throughout the first 6 or 7 years of his career. Why? Even though he was the best player, he didn't have a great team around him. It wasn't until people like Dennis Rodman, Horace Grant, BJ Armstrong, John Paxton, it wasn't until those folks ended up on his team that he was able to actually win championships. And we talked a lot about that. That was the end of the presentation and workshop that I ran in Passaic County for the Cultural Heritage Office. Now, what were the results? What were the findings? Because what I did was I had the folks in the office take a questionnaire or a survey at the very end of the workshop. What I did, and I'm not going to reveal the exact words that people used, but what I am going to do, and what I did in advance of this presentation, was sit down and really think about what the results were, like meaning analyze the data. And with the exception of literally only one person, who, by the way, is actually not even with the organization anymore, every person rated the workshop as exemplary. 90% of the people surveyed told me that because of playing, unlocking the portal, and going through all those activities, they discovered something about themselves that they didn't know before. The employees were happy that the workshop got them moving, meaning, again, the people that I spoke to explained that a lot of times when they do professional development, they just sort of sit there and no one really ever wants to be there. But because the way that our workshop worked, meaning the 20-sided gamified workshop, people are moving around in a physical way, and everybody talked about the fact that it was fun. And also point out, again, I'm using that figure of 90%. Not really, I said all, but it's really 90% of employees, they wanted a second go around. They wanted to do this again. And this might sound silly, but what stood out to me more than anything else about the whole day was the fact that we had an office that didn't always get along, that all of a sudden at the end of the workshop, they all went down the street for ice cream. And to me, that absolutely matters. It's the whole point of what we were doing. My personal takeaways, what I learned from not just this experience, but the other workshops that I've run for adults, I found that games, if they're effectively designed and they're combined with other activities, they're a great way to get people collaborating. They're a great way to get people to learn about who they are. They're great at highlighting underlying skills, which can be later harnessed in the workshop. Meaning, if you realize that you're actually really good at communicating with people, the whole point is then for the employer to push you in a direction where you can use that skill to be helpful. Also, practice said skills, meaning if there are skills like decisiveness or collaboration or data analysis or being efficient, you can practice those skills really effectively with a good game. And last but not least, determine what a person brings to the table as being part of the team. Meaning, you are an employee. What are the things that you're good at that other people aren't that can be really helpful in the work environment? Now, since that first workshop in 2023, we've had two more workshops. We had one on goal setting, which was done as a group. And the other goal setting activity that we did were basically like one-on-one consultations, where essentially, now that I had a really good rapport with everybody, I created different kinds of documents to get people thinking about where they see themselves in 6 months, where they see themselves in a year, where they ultimately want to go. Now, we don't have time to go over all of those different workshops and how they worked, but every single workshop that we've done in that office have been gamified in different ways. All right. So this is the point where what I'm going to do, bear with me for a second. I'll leave this actually up for a moment, but I am going to stop sharing. Um, Part three is really the Q&A, meaning again, I don't know how many of you have questions. I know that Sebastian is going to sort of help facilitate that. But in terms of contact information, 20-sided Gamify does have a website. So www.20sided-gamify-llc.com. If you go there, what you can find out is what our mission statement is all about. You can get access to the podcast. You can get access to our rates, meaning if you were going to hire us to do a job, what that would cost. And there's also some photos up there of some of the events that we've run. And again, this is a very new company. We've really only been around for about a year. So, and the website was literally just launched maybe a month ago. If you wanted to get in touch with us directly, you could email us at 20sidedgamifiedllc@gmail.com. And in terms of Instagram, 20-sided gamified podcast with underscores in between. The podcast is great because in so many different ways, the podcast is really about what we do. So in terms of the folks that we've had on, I mean, we've had authors on, we've had professors on, we've had game designers on. We've also recapped events that we've run. And Kelly is the co-host. There's also a couple of other people in the industry. And what I mean by industry is in the game industry that also helps us with some of the episodes. It's a lot of fun. Most of the time, we're as professional as I sort of ran this little sort of meeting with you guys, so to speak. And sometimes we're just really yuck it up and have fun. And ultimately, if you're not having fun with games, it's a real problem. And I think with that, I'll actually leave it at that. I'm going to hit stop share. All right. And Sebastian, I don't know if you want to run a little bit of the Q&A, but if there are people that have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hey, thanks, Jared. I definitely learned a lot, and it's always good to have a different perspective and so forth. From other game designers and other organizations who do gaming.
Yeah.
So I got some questions that were sent to me via private chat here. So I'll
Okay.
work through the handful that I have here. So
Okay.
one is when you mentioned game-based learning before and so forth, are there any particular like tips on how to do it well, right?
Yeah.
About how to construct it, how to use it, how to apply it, and so forth.
Yeah. So I'm going to sound like a broken record here. The last workshop that I did for Goose is literally all about that exact question. But I can give a short response to that. When we're thinking about game-based learning, right? I always go with a backwards design approach, meaning I say to myself, whether it's students or adults, maybe we can use adults as this example because that's really what this whole seminar has really been about. When I thought about the office in Passaic County that I ended up working with, the big thing was team building. These folks were, just coming out of COVID. These folks were really trying to learn how to be better employees with one another, how to really work well. So, in terms of backwards planning, if I know that that's what I need to do, then I have to pick a game that's going to really bring those skills out. So, that's why I called it Unlocking the Portal, but it's really zombies because zombies is, especially if you're playing it in a collaborative way, it's a great game in terms of working with each other and having to figure out how do we get to the helipad together and not lose anybody. Also, a game like Zombicide, which I've really been playing a lot of. I don't know in terms of people that are here if anybody's ever played that game before, but it's the same deal. If you look at a game like Zombicide, everybody's got a different weapon, everybody's good at something, and you have to collaborate with one another to figure it out. And if you're good, and this is where the whole teaching aspect comes in, if you can make that connection between the game and somebody's real life in the same way that you would do any kind of lesson, meaning, here, I'll give you an example. I did a lesson in my classroom today with students about a really, really macabre subject, the Holocaust. And my job is I have to get the kids to relate to that. I have to take this event that happened a very long time ago and get kids to be empathetic and really learn about that event. So you have to make that connection. Now, another thing I would say about game-based learning, and I would assume that everybody in here is a gamer. I hope that that's not an incorrect assumption, but when we think about the kinds of games we have to pick, keep it simple. That's the other really big, short response that I would give. You have to pick games that are simple. Sometimes, and Kelly, I know, is here, and this has come up many times on our show. I think that people that really like games, sometimes it's only a real game if it's really, really difficult. Meaning it's only a real game if there's tons of charts and tons of complexity and it takes 8 hours to complete. To be completely frank with all of you, if you're planning on using a game-based approach in your classroom, or you're planning on a game-based approach doing some of the work that I'm describing here, you have to pick something that's teachable in 5 or 10 minutes. You have to pick something in which the rules are literally on one page. Look at my dear friend Kelly McManus in the chat. It has to be accessible, because a lot of times, whereas we in this space might be gamers, and look, I hope I don't sound arrogant, but dude, I've been doing this my entire life. I've been gaming my entire life. For people that aren't gamers, looking at a QRS from a game sometimes can be like reading a different language. So it has to be accessible. And I will leave that response there. So Sebastian, whenever you're ready, I'm happy to take another one.
So what other activities other than workshops can be combined with games to get good results?
Honestly, in my opinion, I'm not an expert in some of the activities some of you guys might do, but I would say a good game can be really used for anything. And you can think of different kinds of training and activities as games. So I used an MMA example before. For those of you that are super athletic, whether you play, I don't know, whatever you might play, if you might play lacrosse or you might play football, or maybe you box or you do MMA or whatever it might be, even something like that, you can absolutely gamify a training session. Meaning, let's say for every leg kick you get a point, for every takedown you get, it's 2 points. You can gamify just about anything. And what we know about games from a psychology standpoint is games incentivize people to create goals, and games incentivize people to be motivated in order to do well. Sometimes, for example, and I can actually speak specifically about this, when I was in better shape pre-COVID, uh, I used to box all the time. And one of the games that we would play is the instructor would have a deck of cards, and every time an ace came out, you might have to do 10 push-ups. Every time a king or queen came out, you might have to do 5 jumping jacks. And basically, it was a gamified approach to calisthenics. So again, the question's a really good question, and it's a little bit abstract, but in my opinion, you can basically take a game and tailor it to just about anything it is that you're trying to work on. That would be my answer to that question.
The next question asks, what is the level of complexity that you realistically accomplish in the context of either a 60 or 90-minute class or training session? Can you give us an example of one of those more
Yeah.
complex games you've used?
No, actually, I'm just being honest. I stray away from that. If Now, don't get me wrong. If I Let me back up for a second. I'm rushing this question a little bit. When I taught at Hackley, and Mike Canarino and I literally had an entire class in which it was an elective that kids would sign up for, and we literally taught English and history through the lens of Dungeons and Dragons. When you have time, you can add complexity. Meaning, I might have a really complicated D&D scenario that's really heavy. Meaning, the players, for example, enter a village, and what they see uh, are elves that are forcing orcs to work in a salt mine. And it's not because the orcs are skilled at working in a salt mine. It's because the elves look down on the orcs, right? And the players now are in this sort of existential crisis where they have to sort of debate like what to do, what's the moral thing to do, but does the moral thing get in the way of the overall mission? And after playing that game, we might have 2 or 3 classes to roll that out. So when I think about complexity, to me, that's a really complex scenario. You can do that in a classroom where you have a lot of time. But honestly, I find that I use games as a tool to get me somewhere. I I don't get me wrong. You can play a game that's complex for the sake of it because the complexity of the game itself is what you're sort of trying to teach to the people playing it. But I don't usually use games like that. I want games that are short, simple, to the point, where the mechanics of the game are simple, but the outcomes and the way that people have to think about the game, that's where you get the complexity. Now, I'll give you an example of that. Kelly and I the other day played a game called Live Free or Die from Little Wars TV. And by the way, Sebastian, I hope it's not weird if I'm jumping in here, but correct me if I'm wrong. You know those guys and you have game with them, right?
Yeah, we did a chosen reservoir
Yeah,
scenario with them.
that's what I thought. They are masters at taking a game like Live Free or Die, right? In which the rules are literally on one page, but everything is very elegant. There's an elegant activation system. There's an elegant way of modifying dice rolls where players don't have to spend a half hour trying to figure out what they need on their dice roll. And because you can master those techniques, master those rules quickly, how you can get to what's really important, which is how am I fighting this battle? How am I working with the people on my team? What do I need to activate? Which direction should I attack? So to me, I really honestly stray away from complex games. Meaning, here, I'll give you an example. I would, as much as I love a game like Dune Imperium, or again, I'm kind of doing this off the top of my head, or a game like Root. I love those games, but they are too complicated for me to go into a 90-minute workshop and run it. Now, if I had 3 days, if I had a whole day just to teach people how to play Dune, that's a different story. So it's all about time and having the right amount of time to be able to do whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. By the way, I hope I'm answering these questions. I hope I'm not being too circuitous. I just want to kind of put that out there.
So, one thing I will add to what Jared said is that there are lots of different games from like small micro games like Polo Mori does a whole genre of mini games, right? They're designed to be small. Hollandspiel does a bunch of them. They're designed to be quick playing, like Catastrophe Games does them, and so forth. So there are games designed to be really short. You have to balance the level of abstraction and decision that you're having them play to whatever you're trying to teach. So that and also there are different ways to look at complexity and decision making in the sense that you can run a really small game multiple times to allow players to see different iterations of a problem versus the depth of a decision space. So those are just my 2 cents. But Jared, are there any games you might use to teach global strategic thinking?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what comes to mind immediately for me is diplomacy. I think diplomacy is one of the absolute best teaching games in so many different ways. My students love it, and when I've run it for adults, they love it as well. Let me explain why. Again, it kind of gets back to a number of the points that I've sort of already made. One of the best things about diplomacy are there really are only a few rules. There's no dice in the game. There's really no luck, and it's a great platform. It's almost akin. I don't know if there are any musicians here, but it's almost akin to the kind of player, a guitar player that plays an amp with almost no effects on it, but has a giant pedal board in front of them, and that's almost like their color palette. I see diplomacy that way because what I love about it is you can add layers to it. You could take mechanics from other games and build on it. So, for example, you could very easily build a system of trading cards where there are supplies that you could use when you're wheeling and dealing with other nations. You could add a debate element to it. So if you're in a classroom, for example, you could play a couple of turns and then have like a big conference or a congress, almost like Model UN. I don't know if anybody in here is familiar with Model UN. In a lot of ways, Model UN is also something I'd add to this as well. Like the whole format that they use is really wonderful for teaching all of this. But yeah, with something like diplomacy, you have to engage with the people around you. You have to learn how to lie, but you also have to learn how to be a really, really, really great ally. Because you cannot win by yourself. It's almost impossible to win that game on your own. So, in terms of strategic thinking, like on a global scale, I love games of that ilk. One other thing. I don't know if you guys are familiar because I know they're from that area. Fort Circle games are great. So I always screw names up, but like people like Kevin Bertram. I also I'm just thinking Tory Brown. There's a bunch of folks that are associated with that company. I wouldn't necessarily call their games like they're not looking at the entire world, but they are looking at very specific historical events. And again, I would say that they're great strategic games where the rules are really simple, but with the different mechanics that they use, you really have to think ahead. You really have to think like 3 or 4 moves in advance, which I love. So like Shores of Tripoli, Votes for Women. I really like those. Twilight Struggle is a great game. Though it's only 2 players, so it's a little bit hard to use in the classroom. But there are ways that you can sort of modify it to get more people playing, or you can just buy like lots of different boards and have people playing like one-off games with one another. So fire away if there are more questions.
Sorry, I was not unmuted.
No, no, don't
Can
worry
you
about it. You don't
speak
have to apologize.
can you speak to the tension between the psychological aspect of gaming versus like teaching content accurately?
Yeah. That's a really good question. Here's my first point about this. When it comes to teaching the content accurately, that's where debrief is very, very, very vital. If you don't debrief, you might as well not game in the classroom or in a workplace. That being said, I absolutely loathe games in which there's almost a predetermined outcome based on the historical circumstance. Meaning, if you play a game about the Congress of Vienna and the conference shakes out exactly how it did in real life every time you play, then you're not really playing a game. You're more like a parrot, or like an automaton, right? So to me, if we're bringing the psychological part in, what I want my players to do in a game is I want my players to have fun. I want them to try to do better than their countries did in real life. So, for example, if you're at the Congress of Vienna and you're playing France, the goal would be to not necessarily lose all of Napoleon's conquests, right? You want to do better than France did in reality. But what you have to do is when you're done with the game, you've got to give the kids an assignment. Or if you're doing this in a professional setting, you have to give an activity at the end in which you compare the results of what happened in the game to the results of what happened in reality. Because the last thing you want is for players to leave that table thinking that history is actually quite different, meaning you're playing a game about the Congress of Vienna and you learn from the game all sorts of backwards things about what Imperial Russia got out of the Congress. So you don't want that to happen. And again, in terms of like that psychological tension, yeah, you want that. You definitely want that in a game. You want people to be biting their nails. Like that photo that I showed you of that player at the Passaic County event where she was just beside herself when all of the zombies were sort of running towards her and she just wanted to get away and be safe. You want players to feel like that because if if the game is like washing your mouth with Listerine, like that is not necessarily something that is going to be fun. If people are not having fun, if it's not memorable, then again, you may as well not even play. And again, I hope that kind of cut to the core of the question. If anything I'm answering is not, you can always reach out to 20-sided gamified via our Gmail, which I had mentioned a little while ago.
Hey, Jared, the next question asks, for the games that are focused on a problem or issue instead of self-reflection or teaching gaming for analysis, insight for motivation and drivers and so forth, are there best practices that can help participants get the most out of a situation,
Oh,
like on a
absolutely.
particular problem?
Oh, absolutely. So what I think of when I hear that question is something like Settlers of Catan, right? Which I absolutely love that game. But it's that game is very cut and dry. Like there is a goal, like you have to accumulate X amount of points by the end of the game and you win. I always look at games as opportunities to sort of build on and add your own spin. That doesn't necessarily mean changing the game. It just means that you have to ask the right questions of players in order to get them thinking about whatever your goals are. So again, you have to remember, I'm kind of doing this off the top of my head. But if you are playing a game like Settlers of Catan and you're just sort of playing and you're not thinking about it, you have to make players think about it. So you might want to set some goals in advance where you ask players to keep track of their strategy that they're using as the game is going on, meaning why are you building that road in that particular direction? What is it about knights that you think are really, really valuable? How did you broker the best deals with your peers in order to get the things that you want? When did you have to give up certain elements of your strategy in order to reach a more long-term goal? Those are almost, and again, I don't know, maybe people do think about those things, but I would argue that you're almost never thinking about those things when you're playing. Maybe intuitively you are, but you're not necessarily, it's not like you're writing those kinds of concepts down and tracking it. That's how I would answer that question. I mean, you think about the kinds of goals that you have for your players and you build those questions into the both gameplay and the debrief at the end. So point being, even if the game is not necessarily uh, a a game about self-reflection, there are still ways to get people to be reflective about how they're actually playing that game. And then they can absolutely learn something about themselves. And again, if I mean, I don't necessarily want to go down this rabbit hole too deep, but I mean, I don't know about you guys, but even sitting down with a game like Settlers of Catan or something like Monopoly or something along those lines, man, you learn a lot about people when they're playing. You learn about the people that have, repressed rage inside of them, or you learn about people that are a little bit depressed because you can kind of see the second something doesn't go right, uh, they fall apart. You can see the megalomaniacs. Again, unless I'm crazy, I don't think I am. I'm pretty sure, though, when you play games, you learn a lot about people's mindset. And I think if you're in this space and you want to teach or you want to do some of this kind of work, you really have to learn how to ask the right questions and really watch people when they're playing a game. Meaning, who are the people that are taking charge? Who are the people that are sort of sitting back? All of that is really great information, whether you're a teacher trying to help them be better or whether you're in a professional development environment where you're trying to get somebody to be better at their job. I think all of that's really important.
So we have a clarification to one of the questions before. When they ask what other activities can be done in support in and around supporting games, they meant like other things beyond games, like what activities can be part of the wider like sort of ecosystem of games, learning, and so forth, I think.
What do you mean by activity? What does the word activity mean?
I think they just mean like what other things can they do in the classroom beyond just games, or the
Oh,
things that help
oh,
enhance games.
oh. Okay, all right. So if I'm understanding this right, like putting games to the sort of side for a moment. To me, like I've been a teacher for 20 years, so to me it's all about interaction. So if we're thinking about different kinds of activities that could work similarly to games, I love debates, meaning I love asking kids to debate topics. And again, that's a little bit gamey because I don't just mean like, you ask a couple of kids questions and you try to get them to disagree on something for some overall value. What I really mean is setting up a parliamentary style debate where there's, a topic, and one side is defending that topic and one side is questioning that topic. That's a really tried and true way to kind of get in there and get kids to really think outside the box in the same way that a game might. Um, Again, I hope I'm understanding the question. Like when I hear the word activity, I love group work. I love pairing people up. Sometimes kids that know each other really well, and in other cases, kids who might not necessarily be the closest. I love pairing people up based on their skill sets and ask them to do something creative. So again, if I hope I'm understanding this question right, otherwise I'm probably boring the hell out of a lot of people right now. But like one of my favorite things to do would be something really outside the box. So for example, at my own school when we were learning about industrialization and we were learning about all the different philosophies that started to appear in the middle of the 1800s and into the 1900s, things like communism, socialism, the idea of utopia, the idea of utilitarianism. In the same way that a game might or a debate might, what I asked the kids to do was I said, all right, think about what utilitarianism means, it's a concept. And what I want you to do is I want you to build your own private school. And I want the central theme of the school to be rooted in the concept of utilitarianism. So show me that you understand what utilitarianism is through the design of your school. And the design of that school should be so good, so seamless, that if you were to tell your parents about it, they would think that it's real. I love, as a teacher, going in those kinds of directions.
So this next one is interesting. It says, how good of idea of creating a game that is based on scientific concepts such as the periodic table? Could it be for specific people? Um,
So, meaning, can you create a game about the periodic table? Is that kind of the question?
I think so, if I'm understanding this correctly, or at least have games that have core scientific concepts around them, right? That
Oh,
use the periodic table around it.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn to some extent because obviously I'm more of a humanities person, but in my opinion, given time, I could probably design a game just about anything. Again, it's all about backwards planning. For the person that's asking about, I'm trying to teach kids or adults, whomever, about the periodic table, you have to say to yourself, what is it that I want these students to know when this lesson or game is over about the periodic table? Once you know what it is that you want to achieve, you would then need to think about some simple types of game mechanics. Maybe it might be a card game. Maybe it might be a board game. Hell, maybe you might create a role playing game in which characters are based around concepts from the periodic table. Then you play that game. And the whole point is for whatever your learning goal is in the end, whatever it is that you wanted those students to know, the game is supposed to highlight and bring that out. Now, I can't tell you exactly what that game would look like in the moment, but I've known science teachers, people who taught within secondary schools where they will, it's not the periodic table, but they're doing a unit on animals and they create a basically like a March Madness game around which are the most badass animals, and based on the skill sets that those animals have, which animals would win in a fight. And there is some degree of data out there based on like how animals kill and things like that, where you could get students to actually have to research those kinds of things and make a judgment call about which animal would win. You can more or less gamify just about anything. Okay. One other thing. Um, because again, even me as an experienced gamer, I really try not to invent the wheel. I would, if I were designing a game about the periodic table, I would probably try to find a game that I already like and think about how I can adapt it to using the periodic table. So, for example, just really silly, but let's say I love Magic the Gathering. I love that mana system. I love the idea of having cards in my hand and using that mana to trigger effects and things like that. You start with those core mechanics and you use those and adapt those to work for something about the periodic table, which could actually be really fun if you think about it. Again, this is a question I've never been asked in my life. So I think you could actually do something really fun like that. You'd have like a rating system for what are, certain elements capable of. I think it could be really fun.
So the next one says, where do the name 20-sided come from for Jason's firm?
Yeah, it's a good question. I am. Well, look. I mean, I'll say this. I like the name a lot. I am terrible though at naming things. Like I'm a musician as well. It's always hard to name your songs. When I was thinking about that term, like 20-sided gamified, um, obviously the 20-sided comes from arguably the, I don't know, if you think about Stranger Things, like the other than Magic or Monopoly or Scrabble, D&D is just, it's almost a synonym at this point for gaming. I feel like everybody knows what D&D is. I also feel like if you think about, the idea of gaming, look at the games that kids are playing on their phones now. It all kind of comes from the idea of D&D. And when I said to myself, because look, there's a lot, let's put the business to the side for a second and just think about the podcast. There are lots of podcasts out there about Warhammer. There's lots of podcasts out there about D&D. There's lots of podcasts about Euro games. There's really not that many podcasts that bring everything together, all different types of games into an environment where you can kind of talk about them and talk shop. So when I thought about the idea of the 20-sided die, I really just associate that with games, meaning I think game and I think a 20-sided die. And then the whole idea of gamified is a huge part of what I do and what I have been doing for a really, really long time. I love gamifying things. So it seemed like a no-brainer to kind of put those together. And it also rolls off the tongue really well. 20-sided gamified podcast, it just rolls well. And I love saying it. So if it's going to be something I have to say all the time, it better roll off the tongue well.
So that's all the questions I see. I'll give a few seconds for anyone who has any last minute questions for Jared. But otherwise, I will begin to thank you for spending your Tuesday evening with us and volunteering your time. As always, you're always welcome here, and appreciate your perspective. And thank you for our audience for asking such great questions. It sounds like we have some educators and teachers out there in the
Yeah.
audience tonight. So
Yeah, it was a
again,
ton of fun.
thank you, Jared. Appreciate it. And thank you for everyone. And see you all next time.
Hey, Sebastian, before you sign off, can I compliment you for a second?
Sure,
Is
I
that cool?
guess.
I want to compliment you because you're a person in this world that everybody seems to know. And I just wanted to make sure that everybody that's in this meeting knows that you are such a tour de force when it comes to gaming and education. And I just appreciate the fact that this platform exists for people to come onto. It's literally the other reason I made the podcast, right? Because in a lot of ways, I'm emulating what you and other folks have already done. So I just wanted to say that before we all signed off.
Thanks, Jared. I appreciate it. And obviously for our audience, now you know that Jared has been paid for this webinar. I'm just kidding. But I appreciate
I
everyone.
know.
Thank you again. Have a good
Thanks,
one.
guys. Bye.